week 10. We are in the home stretch of the semester. And this week we have 2 guest lectures, which is the cool part of the class that you get exposure to other faculty other than myself, who you might want to work with for research projects and stuff like that. Today, Dr. Pryor obviously needs no introduction. It's the department chair, and he's here to talk with us about machine learning.
Okay, thank you.
So you got the recording going and you got the screen share.
Yes.
Awesome, thank you.
So when Meredith asked me to talk about machine learning, it was, oh Lord, how do you do that in one lecture? It's sort of like boiling an ocean. So this is the high points, a few high points that I think are important. And there'll come a point where we'll discuss a particular, well, in fact, very soon we'll discuss a problem and you'll see what I mean. Anyway, where do you start with machine learning? Well, I always start with that guy. I don't know whether you recognize him or not. He's a fellow, was a fellow of King's College, Cambridge. Very, very important to the war effort in World War II, working at Bletchley Park, which is the British home of GCHQ, their equivalent of our NSA. And very important to the evolution of computing. So he published a number of works during his life, but really he published 2 main papers that are really the basis of everything that, pretty much everything we do. The first paper is this one, on computable numbers with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem. And as you can see, the man's name is Alan Turing. So first, what's an Entscheidungsproblem? Very famous mathematician David Hilbert posed a problem which was, is it possible for a procedure, mechanism, what we would say algorithm, to prove all of the theorems in any formal system? A formal system, the most common ones we are familiar with are branches of mathematics, algebra, geometry. Is there a way to prove all the theorems with a mechanical process? And he posed that problem in 1928, even though it was really a repeat of something that Leibniz had started in the 18th century. But it was a very important problem in the late 20s, early 30s. The problem was put to bed by Kurt Gödel, who you may have heard of his theorem. He dealt with this in a very general way. His incompleteness theorem, which he published in 1931, defines computability. And in particular, it proved that Hilbert was wrong, that there is no such mechanism. And why is this important? Well, several philosophers and mathematicians, including people like Roger Penrose in the UK, have argued that this is the distinction between computers and brains, because brains can do things that are non-computable. So we're not, if you will, wet computers. Our brains are not wet computers. They can do things that no algorithm can do. And this becomes important a little bit later when we talk about AI. But back to Turing, he and Frank Church, they collaborated a little bit, but they both published papers dealing with various parts of this problem. And in particular, the Entscheidung problem is not the whole thing. It's known as the decision problem. How do I know if I've proven a theorem? And Church showed that, well, you can't know. And Turing's part of the problem was, how would I know, how can I prove that the algorithm would ever stop? And that's why this is relevant to today's lecture, because there's so much topic here that you may be wondering a while from now, how do I know if this guy's ever going to stop talking? So Turing's solution to this stopping problem was really important. He invented what he called the universal machine. We call it a Turing machine. It is the mathematical model of every digital computer that's ever been built. Now, there are two kinds of computers that it doesn't describe. Do you know what those are? What other two kinds of computers are there other than a digital computer? I'm sorry?
A physical computer?
Well, actually, that is true, like a Babbage computing engine, a mechanical computer. Technically, as long as they're dealing with binary logic, they fall under Turing, a Turing machine. Now, the other two are an analog computer, which not too many people use anymore, but I'm going to actually mention it again in another context. Analog computers basically solve continuous functions, problems that deal with continuous mathematical functions. And they're basically a bunch of amplifiers. It's stereo equipment used to solve computing problems. And the other form is brand new. It's called a quantum computer. Quantum computers work by completely different physics, and they are not Turing machines. So anyway, Turing's first paper, published in the Annals of the Royal Society, or I forgot what the full title is. I think it's on here someplace. I guess not. Was work that he did as a student. So as a student at Cambridge, his very first paper defined all computers, which is pretty good work for your first student paper. His second paper he published after the war, where obviously he was the guy who was cracking codes at Bletchley Park. He also had a very interesting job during the war. He was Winston Churchill's science advisor. And he had perhaps the most unique security clearance ever known. He had a handwritten note from Winston Churchill, countersigned by Franklin Roosevelt, that said, show him everything. So he knew about the atomic bomb, he knew about everything. Okay, so after the war, he became very interested in how might computers think? He was very interested in computers from his work at Bletchley Park, and in fact was busily building several computers. Finally, the one that finally came to being was at the University of Manchester. But he published this paper in a journal called Mind. The paper is called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And his central question was, can a computer think? Now, he had no idea how to explain consciousness or thought. We still don't. We have no real definition. So his main contribution was to come up with a operational definition of what it means to think or to be conscious or to be sentient. And he called that The Imitation Game. You might have seen a movie by that name. It was actually dealing with a different aspect of the imitation, but the imitation game was how he set up a test for whether or not an algorithm or a program of some kind could pass as a human, could imitate a human. And in his version of it, imagine you're in this room, and on the other side of that wall, there's another entity. And the only way you can communicate with that other entity is through a keyboard. And you can ask any questions you want, and you can go at it as long as you want. And if in the end you can't tell whether that's a machine or a person, if it is a machine, it wins. It wins the Turing test. That's what we call the imitation game. Now, Turing was asked in 1950 by the BBC, how long would it take for a computer to pass this test? And he said, 60 years. Now, at the time, the most powerful computer in the world had less storage and compute capacity than our average microwave oven. But he said 60 years. Well, 64 years later, in theory, a computer passed the Turing test, although most experts argue that the game was rigged. So we'll say that the Turing test really hasn't been passed yet, but it is a very important operational definition for artificial intelligence. And in this same paper, Turing laid out the basis of this entire lecture today, which is that in order for machines to perform tasks similar to what humans do, they have to know how to learn. The most important part for him of artificial intelligence was machine learning. Now, before I leave the Turing test, You've all taken the inverse Turing test. I.e., how do you prove that you're a human and not a machine? Have you ever used CAPTCHA? You know, one of those stupid things where before you can log in, you have to read some garbled thing and type in what it really said. That is an inverse Turing test. It's a task that's designed to be such that a human can do it and a machine can't. So the Turing test is used every single day by millions of people around the world, only in reverse. We have to prove that we're human, not machines. The machine is trying to prove the opposite. Okay, so the only way that the machine can learn to think, according to Alan Turing, was to learn. So how do humans think? How do humans learn? Amazingly enough, it starts with, the answer to that question starts with this guy. And if you've seen I think my most recent lecture in our seminar series, I introduced him before. Very famous scientist, Spanish scientist, whose name is Ramon y Cajal. He won the Nobel Prize in 1906 for the neuron doctrine, i.e., humans think because our brains are full of specific kinds of cells called neurons. They look sort of like that. Before that, nobody had the slightest clue how we thought. In fact, there were theories that your liver was a source of consciousness, or your heart, you know. But Cajal said, no, it's actually brains. And brains have these unique, oops, can't get a cursor over there. Oh, there we go. Brains have these unique cells, and the cells have particular properties. They have first of all, soma, a cell body, and attached to that are a set of processes called dendrites. Most cases are short, although there are some types of neurons where that's not true. This is where they collect inputs, and the cell will fire what's called an action potential, which goes down this long process called an axon. Myelin is important because it's actually part of a repeating process that makes sure that the signal gets all the way to the end. And at the end, this neuron forms what are called synapses. This is a blown up of the synapse to the dendrites of the next neuron. Now that's the simple view. Actually, axons can talk to axons, dendrites to dendrites. It's all mixed up. But in reality, this is the basis of his neuron document. And so what we see is an electrical process, an electrical signal comes in here. It's somehow processed in here, and the decision is made whether or not I send on another signal. When it gets to the endpoint here into what's called the synapse, a whole bunch of really complicated biochemistry happens because there's not a direct physical connection between these two. Chemicals are released here, they're absorbed by receptors on the other side, and that tells this thing whether it's excited or inhibited, because you can turn up the volume or turn it down depending upon the kind of chemicals that are released here. So that's the basic idea of how neurons process information, and it's the basis of thinking, according to this theory. Actually, it's the basis certainly for the kind of responses that we see. We think of it as muscle memory. Yeah?
I'm trying to grow. Were the slides uploaded on the Blackboard?
No, probably not.
Okay.
I'll give it to you, though. Yeah. So this is how we process information in a wet computer, but what does it have to do with the dry kind? Well, first of all, before I move on, this is a hand-drawn picture from Cajal that points out that there are lots of different sizes and shapes of neurons, and they're connected in networks. And that's the key. You can start with an individual neuron, and in fact, I once built a model with a student of a particular type of neuron called a cerebellar granule cell, and showed that it can do a lot of computations just by itself. But it's really the network properties that are important, and that's what we're going to talk about in the first step of machine learning. So this is another version of a neuron, and I've laid it out as inputs, inputs, cell body, transmitting down to the outputs, which are synapses. And by the way, these axons can be long. There are, I've forgotten how many thousand kilometers of axons in your body, but some of them reach from your brainstem all the way down to the bottom of your feet. So they can be quite long. So in 1957, a guy named Frank Rosenblatt, who was working at Cornell, took this idea, which influenced all of the ideas of computer learning and machine intelligence up to that point. But nobody actually did anything with it until Rosenblatt came along, and he invented a thing called a perceptron. And you can see these look very similar. There are a bunch of inputs coming in over here. They have these interesting W's here that I'll explain in a minute. They go to a cell body where they're added up. Then a function is applied. And this function can be a variety of different things. I show it as a step. It can be just a linear, it can be a ramp, a linear function, it can be a sigmoid. There are lots of different functions can be applied there. But the whole idea is I'm going to integrate these inputs and I'm going to decide whether or not I fire as an output. Okay? This is referred to as a feed-forward neural network. It's also called a perceptron, which is the original version of it. Now, Rosenblatt, although it was implemented as an algorithm in software, and that's the way it's used today, he actually designed it to be a piece of hardware, a thinking machine. And this was the basis of a new generation of computers. And it's what started artificial intelligence research and machine learning. Until this book came out by Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert. This book killed artificial intelligence and machine learning research for a decade. It said, well, this stupid thing can't even compute an exclusive OR, simple logic function, which, by the way, the cerebellar granule cell could. So therefore, it's useless. Well, Minsky was, of course, completely wrong, because all you had to do was build a network of them, and they work just fine. So we'll ignore Minsky. We will get onto networks in a minute, but I want to first talk about, well, how does a perceptron learn? And it turns out perceptron learns the same way that neuron does. And this is a different sort of schematic of the perceptron. And the idea here is I'm going to feed inputs in over here. I'm going to multiply input by this weight function. As I said, I'm going to sum them all up and decide whether or not I fire. Okay, but for a given input, I know the output. I have a training set of data where I know the right answers. So I can train this by presenting inputs, looking at the outputs, and as this points out here, comparing the two, taking the difference between the desired output and the one I got, scaling that by the size of the input, and adding that to the weight at time 1 to give me the weight at time 2. So I change the weights, and I keep iterating on this until my error is less than some threshold. Now, this is a sum of squares, which is it's a sum of squared error, which is common. Now, a couple of important points. I mentioned the training set. I have to have labeled data where some entity, usually a human, has said, this is the right answer. And these, for each example, each sample of my training set, I have a set of features. And they're arranged in this order from 1 to n, and they're called a feature vector. So this is an n-dimensional feature vector that defines an n-dimensional feature space. So you can think of it as if I have 10 dimensions, in a 10-dimensional space, my input is 1 point. This becomes important later, and I'm going to show you some neat tricks of using those high-dimensional spaces. And it's also important to us in biomedical informatics because almost all of our work involves big data, high-dimensional feature spaces. And so it's important to deal with this idea of the dimensionality of input vectors or feature vectors. The other thing, this is actually how you compute the answer, and it illustrates another important point. You take the inner product or dot product, that's what this is showing here, of the weight vector and the feature vector. And that's all this is. It's a dot product is you multiply the two together and sum the results to get an answer. I brought that up to highlight a point. It's pet issue for me, which is if you're going to be in our field, there are two branches of mathematics that you need to know. Probability theory and statistics and linear algebra. That's linear algebra as an example. Those are the two key things that drive, well, pretty much everything I'm going to show you. If you're going to develop new machine learning algorithms, you need to know a lot of calculus. But to use them, you really need to understand those two branches. Okay, so that's how a perceptron learns, by adjusting the weights, and it's the weights that store the information. Now, I said this is the way neurons learn. Well, it turns out there are two very well studied, very well understood phenomena, one called long-term depression and the other LTP and LTD, long-term depression, long-term potentiation. That's how the weights in a biological neuron are adjusted, by the pattern of firing of that neuron and the inputs that it gets. It uses a process called Hebbian learning usually, which I'm not going to talk about, but that's what neurons use. Neurons that fire together continue to fire together is the simplest version of it. But anyway, they adjust their weights by these two processes of long-term potentiation or depression, because that allows them to adjust the weights up and down. And one of the theories of why you sleep at night is that's how you burn the weights into something more permanent, like, say, changes in the DNA and the end of the neuron. Okay, so back to Minsky. As I said, the solution to Minsky's problem was don't use one perceptron, use a network of them. The brain doesn't use one neuron, although sometimes I think my dog only has one. But it uses networks of neurons. And so this is an example of, again, a feed-forward neural network. It's a 3-layer network: input units, hidden layers, output units. So I present my inputs here. Some interesting stuff happens in this hidden layer. Turns out you can have as many hidden layers as you want. People get really carried away with these things. And the answer comes out the output unit. Okay, so how does this thing learn? Well, it's complicated, but it's based upon a fairly simple idea in mathematics, which is called gradient descent. And this is an example of calculating the gradient, which would be in this one-dimensional problem the derivative of the error with respect to the given weight. But of course, as I said, the weight vector is high dimensional, so that's why it's a partial derivative, because you have to do it over every weight. And this is the problem in schematic form that you're trying to solve. This is the error as a function of weight. It may or may not look like this, but drawing it this way illustrates a key problem. What you want to do is minimize the error. You want to keep adjusting the weights until you minimize the error. So you want this place down here. You don't want to get trapped over here, which is a local minimum that gives you the wrong answer. So gradient descent is really, I'm going to search through this error surface for each weight, finding the place that has the steepest gradient, the largest value of this derivative, so that I'm looking for, if I'm out here, I'm going to go this way rather than that way. And so that's the basic idea. And as it turns out, the backpropagation algorithm is a way of, based upon, if you know calculus, the chain rule, for applying this gradient problem backward across all the layers. And so I'm looking at the output here relative to the input, calculating an error, and the backpropagation problem allows me to adjust the weights at each level. And so I spread that knowledge I've gained across all of these weights, but in each case I'm solving this kind of problem. And it's a fairly cool algorithm that works quickly. It was originally developed by Rummel Hart and Williams and somebody else. Rommel Hart was one of the founders of something called parallel distributed computing. It's a wonderful book. I didn't bring it with me. I have a copy of it. But the idea there is, can I do computing with connectionist models? That is, models like this that are based upon neural networks. And I said I was going to mention the problem of analog computers, and I'm going to do that in a strange way. And that is, well, let me stop for a minute before I do that. I'll come back to it because I want to ask you a question first and introduce supervised and unsupervised learning in the correct way. So let's remind you what I said when I introduced the perceptron. I said you have to have labeled data. You have to have a set of data where you know what the right answer is in order to train your neural network. You also need to have a test set, another set that says, I still know the right answers, but I can then determine whether the algorithm is giving me the right answer, and I can actually build an ROC curve. So what's wrong with this setup? What's wrong with the idea of I have to have a training set where I know the right answers? Bingo! Excellent point. Most of us have been trained throughout our school education that there's always the right answer. It's the one the teacher has, right? Well, in science, there are no right answers. If you're a physicist, you can have a very detailed mathematical theory and you can predict. In biology, we don't have that level of sophistication, so we don't actually know what the right answers are. I do a lot of imaging work, and if I get to it, you're going to get to see some of that. How do I know if this patient has lung cancer by looking at their CT images of their lungs? And the answer is because some human being expert said they did. And usually it's a radiologist says, I think they do, and a pathologist says, yep, they do. It's a building up consensus among physicians, but it's still an opinion. There's no ground truth. So consequently, I can train machine learning algorithms all day, and they can only be ever as good as the people who define the truth. So if I have one that's actually better than humans, it will be penalized because it gets the wrong answers. The humans said so. This is a really important problem, and if I had another day, I would tell you some of the solutions that have been proposed for that problem because it's one that I'm interested in. But that's one of the big problems with supervised learning, and that's the kind of learning that we're just talking about, where you're training the system based upon examples that are known, with known answers. Now, the other approach is unsupervised learning, and that's where I was going to get back to analog computers, because in neural network, there's a whole huge class of neural networks that we're not going to talk about that are analog networks. They don't work, as I've just shown you, with presenting a future vector. They work by having continuous streams of data coming into them. And Grossberg and a bunch of others, Conan, created variations on the same idea, which comes from biology, that says the combination of inhibition and excitation, if you put the architecture correctly, you throw in a signal, and the system will resonate, it'll bounce around all over the place, and then it will settle on an answer. And most of these turn out to be nonlinear dynamic systems. So if you've ever heard of that concept before, they define attractors. So what happens is the network falls into the basin of an attractor, and that's how you get an answer. And if it doesn't, well, it just spins around forever, and you turn it off and go on to the next problem. So that is a form of unsupervised learning where I'm throwing at examples, I'm throwing at problems, and it will converge to an answer or not based upon the architecture of the system that I've designed. The more common approach, which we use in more conventional machine learning, is what statisticians call density estimation. I'm actually going to estimate from the data itself patterns in that data that allow me to develop a probability distribution of how this data should be modeled. So one example of density estimation is clustering. I'm going to, in an unsupervised fashion, there are both kinds of clustering algorithms, but there are classes of unsupervised clustering algorithms where I simply throw out the data and it generates clusters based upon patterns that it finds, commonalities that the algorithm finds in the data. I don't tell it what the right answer is, it tells me what the right answer is. So those are examples of unsupervised learning. Another one is reinforcement learning, which is also much more common in neural networks, where I'm basically not looking at the data, I'm looking at about policies about the data, and it's a very complicated idea, but basically, how well can I learn from past actions by creating a rule that describes the past action, and is that rule good? Okay, so the idea is there are both supervised and unsupervised learning models in machine learning, and it's important. The one that most of us use most of the time is supervised, and we struggle with this problem of what is ground truth, who knows what the right answer is in our world. And of course, largely because this is a cartoon that Tracy Nolan gave me, although this is actually where it comes from, that, this is your machine learning system. Yep, you just pour big piles of data in, let linear algebra churn away, and an answer comes out. Well, what happens if the answers don't come out? You just sort of pile. And that's sort of, particularly unsupervised learning, that's sort of the way it works. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, with the unsupervised learning, it seems to me that, I guess you would construct a model with the data you have. And then, because when I tend to think of supervised learning, I think of like the training set,
Mm-hmm.
and then you apply it and you see how things match up, which is definitely supervised. But the unsupervised one, are you just continuously feeding the data into it as time passes? Or, at what point do you have, I guess you could say, like a deliverable product from the unsupervised learning? Is there any validation tool you have?
Right. So, unlike supervised learning where you compute an error function, you know when to stop, unsupervised learning, you don't necessarily know when to stop. So clustering is an example where it usually does converge to an answer because it's simply searching for patterns in the data and saying, okay, these examples look like those examples, I'm going to put them together.
So
and it,
that point,
the unsupervised learning algorithm, frequently what you do is you tell it how many answers you're looking for, and it says, okay, I'm done, I found, I want 4 clusters, I found 4 clusters, I'm done. That's one of the ways of solving it. I already mentioned the recurrent networks or the various forms of artificial neural network that are analog, where I constructed the network to model a particular biological system. And I think I know how that works. And so when it converges to answers that sort of make sense within that construct. And of course, it doesn't always converge. So that's the problem. But unsupervised learning that's why it's not used as much as supervised learning, because it's a trickier thing to set up, except for the idea of clustering, which we all use quite effectively. But again, the other problem is no truth. And I was going to give you an example of that. Maybe this just popped into my brain. We've done a lot of work with lung cancer, as I mentioned, and applying machine learning to characterize lung nodules, which are features in an image which may or may not be cancer. And so I'm going to show you an example where we've done some of that. But the problem is that the humans don't agree on what the answers are. So we're involved in a very large clinical trial called the National Lung Screening Trial. And at the beginning of that trial, there's a feature in a type of lung nodule called a ground glass opacity. And everybody knew it was benign. And by the end of the trial, everybody knew it was cancer. Well, the human beings' knowledge evolved, so their answers evolved. but also the human beings don't always agree. Yeah, frequently radiologists will agree that yes, this person has cancer. Okay, what shows you the cancer? You have as many different answers as you have radiologists. They each picked a different thing. They came to the same conclusion usually, but for different reasons. So I always have an odd number of experts because we use a voting algorithm because they don't agree, and their disagreement rate is really high. So that's why it's very difficult to do machine learning in things like medical imaging, where I have to rely on an expert's opinion of what the right answer is because they don't agree and they change their mind. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a really classic problem in machine learning, and it's one that I've already been talking about, classification. I want to say, does this person have cancer? Yes or no? Based upon some data set that I'm handling. I'm handling the machine learning algorithm. And that data set could be images, it could be their entire medical record, it could be proteomics data, genomics information, you name it. It could be all of the above put into one enormous feature vector that I feed into my machine learning algorithm. And and this actually works out reasonably well because we sort of know whether the person had cancer or not, because we have a lot of follow-up, we treated them, they lived or died, so we have a pretty good handle over time of whether or not they had cancer. So can I predict cancer from these features by using examples where I'm pretty sure the outcome, as opposed to saying a radiologist said that's a cancerous lesion in the image, that one isn't. That's very subjective, and I won't necessarily get the right answer, but at least I can show that I can do as well as the radiologist. Okay, but these are classification problems, and the idea is pretty simple. I've got, as you can see up here, orange dots and blue dots, and I want to separate them into two classes. And so I can draw a straight line. I'll move that line around, but basically I'm going to use some mathematical trick to say, how do I best separate the blue ones from the red ones? Classifiers can be linear, as I showed in this case. They can be very non-linear, as I'm showing in this case. And I'll explain to you one of the ways that you can generate these. If I can build a classifier, I can define that line here defines a mathematical function that allows me to determine which side of the line any given point is. So if you give me a new point, I can apply my function and say, oh, it's on this side, it must be orange, it's on that side, it must be blue. Now that's not always perfect, because you can see there are blue ones over here and orange ones over there, but I've got to, within my acceptable error, I can discriminate between which class which of the two classes a new piece of data should fall. And that's called a discriminant function, and they're extremely useful once you've built your classifier to classify new data. And of course, the classification problem is a tremendously useful one. Okay, so I've talked about ways of classifying already with neural networks, but a very, very common approach for machine learning in the classification problem is a support vector machine. And the support vector machine is more statistical machine learning because it's based on a fairly solid statistics probability theory model. But the basic idea is shown in this figure. What I'm trying to do is separate the two groups with a line, and my rule for where I put the line is, let's maximize the margin. In other words, let's maximize the distance between the two groups. So the margin is this boundary here that separates the two groups, and the line sits right in the middle of it. So I'm trying to calculate that line. Now remember, this is only in 2 dimensions, and I pointed out to you that almost all of our problems are high dimensional. So it's not a line, it's what's called a hyperplane. Imagine if you have a 4-dimensional feature vector that you're trying to classify with, then that line is 3 dimensions. It's 3-dimensional. It's always n-1 dimensions that defines the hyperplane. So in many of the problems that I struggle with. The feature vectors are 256 by 256 elements long, so 256 squared elements long, and I'm trying to do 256 squared minus 1 dimensional hyperplane to separate the curves. So they can be very, very high dimensional spaces. So the reason this is called a support vector machine is both its strength and its weakness. See these points here? This one's labeled X1. I'm sorry, this one's the little red one and the little stars. Those are the points that are closest to the line, to the margin, sorry. And they define, remember each point is a vector in space, right? That's, each point represents one of the samples that I fed in. The samples are all represented as feature vectors. So each one of those is a feature vector. And because they're the set that are closest to the margin, they're called the support vectors for that margin. And as it turns out, if you want to classify something, you actually only have to use those vectors to know which side it's on. That's the good news, but it's also one of the limitations because it means that this is supported by a very small number of points, in this case 3, so it's very easy to overfit the data because it's based upon this small number of support vectors. So there are ways of dealing with that, and there are ways of also dealing with the problem of, well, what if I can't find a line that separates these? What if I can't find the right hyperplane? And so it's variously called the kernel trick. And the idea is that I'm going to find some mathematical function that I apply to my input space to put it into a new higher dimensional feature space. So it increases the dimensionality of the problem, with the idea that I've chosen this function well, so that I can now find a plane in this space. And gee, then when I map it back, what you get is one of those funky nonlinear things, right? And that's how you generate these interesting boundaries that do a really good job of separating them, but they do not look like a plane. They do not look like in any dimension. They're these funny curves. And that's how, this is one of the tricks that you use for doing that, by increasing the dimensionality of the problem until you can find a hyperplane. So what that means is in a support vector machine, you have to find this function, which is usually referred to as a kernel, for reasons we don't care about. And so in addition to finding the plane, you have to first do what's called a model selection process to find the function that will allow you to determine a plane. And so support vector machines actually work in 2 steps. First, it's find the kernel functions, and then once you do this mapping, then find the plane and map it back. So the mathematics of these are complicated. But happily, there's really good, very well validated software that implements them. So what's important is to understand how they work. And the trick is always, if you say, oh, I'm using a support vector machine, okay, and your kernel is, you always have to specify that function so that people know which of the very large number of support vector machines you're actually using. Okay, there's another way of looking at a variety of machine learning problems, but I'm going to continue to be focused on the classification problem. And it's to make decision trees. And so this is an example of a tree. It's a form of graph. Graph is a set of nodes connected by edges, right? And this is a graph that's organized with a root, and then it has parents and children, and so eventually get down to these leaf nodes at the bottom. And so you can define a decision tree, okay? Well, in a random forest, what you do is you take your data, all of the input data, and you randomly select values and create these trees. It's similar to what's known as a genetic algorithm, genetic search algorithm. So I'm randomly selecting data to put into trees, and I build a forest of these trees. And I, that's how to describe this. So I've represented all of my observations with this forest. I allow the forest then to vote on what the right answer is. I compare that to what my training set. And then I modify the forest, and the way I modify the forest is by keeping some trees that worked out pretty well and randomly reshuffling the others. And I keep doing this random reshuffling until this thing, amazingly enough, in a fairly small number of iterations, converges to an answer which meets your error criterion. So it sounds complicated, and it is. Again, there are very good pieces of software, and that implement it. And it has this nice property that the fraction of trees that voted yes gives you a way of calculating the probability that you got the right answer. So at each point, you can iterate. Each iteration, you calculate the probability of this being the right answer, and stop when you've reached your criterion for how close to the right answer. So it's a very nice algorithm, and it can work amazingly quickly. So I'm going to show you an example where we actually use this. I said I was going to inflict images on you. So what we were trying to do was help neurosurgeons figure out how to resect an ugly thing. You can see it on this flare image here, that white blob, or it's segmented out in this cartoon. It's that big red thing. That's called a glioblastoma, or glioblastoma multiforme, or GBM. It's a very deadly form of cancer, brain cancer. It's what killed Ted Kennedy. It is what's currently killing John McCain. There is no cure for GBM. There's some interesting nanoparticles that are almost through the FDA that might help, but right now there's no cure. So the way you treat it is a surgeon goes in and removes it if it's operable. When it's inoperable, they can do some radiation therapy and chemo, but it's basically not going to work out too well. So the question for the surgeon is, where do I cut? The radiologist says, well, I've got, in this case, 8. We actually used 11 different types of MRI imaging, and each of them shows you something different about the anatomy, whether or not there's edema, whether or not there's changes in blood flow patterns, whether or not there are areas that are necrotic because water diffuses uniformly through them. So each of these images tells you a new piece of information. And what we did was stack them all up. So in this case, we had what we're showing here is an 8-dimensional feature vector where each voxel, each little volume element in these 3-dimensional images of a head or of a brain, was represented by a stack where you took the corresponding voxel from each of these image types. There are a bunch of problems with that because they're different resolutions and and some of them are distorted. Won't bore you with that. But anyway, that's what we did. We created 8-dimensional feature vectors, and we fed them into this random forest classifier. We didn't have a large sample size, so we used what was called a leave one out model, where if I have n samples in my training set, I use n-1 to train and predict the 1, and then I randomly select another 1, and I keep doing that until I converge on a stable solution, within my error margin. So that you do that kind of thing sometimes for validation. In this case, because we just didn't have a very large sample, it was preliminary data. And so we came up with a classifier. We said, okay, now let's apply that classifier to the brain. Well, we got sort of what we expected. The green is what the model predicted. The red is what the human expert, in this case it was only one, very, very bright radiology resident. But it wasn't exactly what we expected because we thought the tumor that we would find would be bigger than what the radiologist found. Very good radiologist, she actually did a great job. But what we didn't expect was all this other crap. This is a very highly invasive cancer. You can see the big ones, but you can't see the little ones. So we made a lot of predictions about other focal spots, particularly this big one out here, where this cancer, even if they resected, it would likely recur. Unfortunately, NIH didn't see fit to fund the project, so we never got to follow up. But that was the idea behind this, was first of all to determine where the real boundary was for the surgeon, but then identify these other areas that might also be cancerous because they can be treated with, particularly if it's a large one, you might even be able to see it, and treated with focal radiation therapy or something else. So this was an example of using using a random forest classifier to analyze feature vectors derived from images to give me the ability to determine where the boundary of the tumor was. Now, it's a little more complicated than that because we're actually not working on the physical location. We were working on probability that each voxel was cancer. So it was actually, these are probability predictions. And so you can make a lot of this stuff go away if you change the threshold. And we played around with what is the threshold that is acceptable here. But anyway, get the idea. So we can actually predict the probability of a particular voxel being cancer using a random forest classifier. Okay, so there are a lot of other ways of application of machine learning, but I want to get on to a couple of more current things. And you may have heard this. I think it's impossible to have not heard about deep learning. It's like the thing in science, even though it's been around for decades. It's now the new thing, hot topic. If you're not doing deep learning, well, why are you doing machine learning in the first place? So what is deep learning? I gave you a quote from a very recent book by Goodfellow et al. Deep learning is a particular kind of machine learning that, according to them, achieves great power and flexibility by representing the world as a nested hierarchy of concepts, with each concept defined in relation to simpler concepts and more abstract representations computed in terms of less abstract ones. And it's like, right, what does that mean? Well, to my simple mind, it's simply, instead of having the humans figure out what features are important, we let the machine learn what features are important. It's still a supervised learning model, but now what we're learning is not, we're giving it the problem, does this person have cancer, yes or no? But instead of telling it what the features are, we're saying, you figure out what the features are. We're going to give you the data, and you sort out what the things in that data that are significant. So the machine learning algorithm actually learns this hierarchy of concepts that it uses then to make its prediction. So it is a bit more sophisticated than the simple models that I've shown you before. So this is an example of, there are several common types of deep learning. This is one that we use a lot, a convolutional neural network. And you can see why, because it's really good for images. So first I have to explain, are you all familiar with the idea of a convolution integral? Or a digital filter? Okay, so the simplest way of thinking about this is I want to highlight features in this original image. And so I want to make edges stand out. So I can apply what's called a high-pass filter, which is a filter that suppresses low-frequency things and enhances high-frequency things. Edges are sharp, so they have high-frequency content. And you do that, there's a process called, you take a kernel, another use of the term kernel in this case, and you convolve that with the data. Convolution is an integral process that is very well defined in digital signal processing. This is imaging processing. So I'm going to do the convolution by taking a matrix, which is my filter matrix, and applying it to the original image. And the matrix is small, maybe 3 by 3, 6 by 6, whatever. And the way I do that is an approach to that integral called shift and add. I put it over the first pixel in the upper left-hand corner. I multiply each element in my matrix by each element that it covers in the image, add them all up, and then answer goes in the first position. I shift by one position and do it again. That's a digital version of a convolution integral, and it's how we apply digital filters. And so the idea here is I start with an image, and I apply a set of convolution layers. Depending on the problem, you arrange these things differently. This is actually somebody else's problem, not the one that we used, but it shows the example. So convolution layers apply digital filters, which are based on weight matrices or filter matrices, and they generate feature maps by themselves. They highlight different features. So obviously, you put some human input into what filter you apply. but it's very general. You know, I'm going to apply, as I said, a high-pass filter to amplify edges. I'm going to put in a Gabor kernel so that I'm going to look at texture. You know, depending on what you choose as your filters, you get different features coming out. Okay. Then there are subsampling steps. That's what these pooling things are called. Or I'm going to reduce the size of the data by, it's a different kind of filter. It's essentially a low-pass filter where I'm just going to average across the neighboring voxels to make a smaller version of it. There's another step in here that you see called normalization step, and those used to be quite popular. Turns out what it was is to renormalize the data so that it fits within a given range. Turns out it doesn't. You can put them in, take them out, doesn't really change the answer, so people don't put them in anymore. That's why I didn't bother explaining them in any great detail. And so you have this cascade of convolution steps, and then at the end, you usually have a pool that you put them together, and you feed the feature vectors into pretty much that standard 3-layer neural network that I showed you a long time ago that combines it and gives you the answer. And so to train it, guess what? You just use a modification of backpropagation, where you start at the answer and you adjust the weights going back. So out here in this neural network, they're the kind of weights we talked about before, but in these convolution steps, they're adjusting the characteristics of the filters. This is where it gets tricky, right? I started off by engineering filters, but as it learns, it rewrites its own filters. So you have no idea what features it's looking at. It generates them by itself. And that's the real unique feature of this type of deep learning is it changes what it's looking for in the images depending upon its own rules for how do I get a better answer. And this is just one of the ways that we use. Once you've trained a thing, you say, okay, what were you looking at? You know, we know what radiologists look at. What was the computer looking at? And usually it makes no sense. We don't know why it chose these particular features, but it works. And so I'm going to show you an example of this. This is a paper that's in review at Nature at the moment. Jason Causey is a student actually in the ULR program. He works with Zhezhen Wang, who's at Arkansas State. They're both collaborators on a NCI grant that we have. And so we did what to me was a very interesting experiment. I'm used to starting down here. I have a data set that a set of radiologists, unfortunately an even number, it was 4, have identified lung nodules. I mentioned that before, and this is sort of what a lung nodule looks like. On a CT image, it's that blob, right? So the radiologists characterized the blobs. They said, here's a set of blobs, and they're this big, and da, da, da. But more importantly, they said, you see the red line around it? They have this boundary. So we developed, when I was at WashU, a 121-dimensional feature set that we extract. These are called human-engineered features. I put my own knowledge based on what radiologists look at into the process, and so I extract features that I think are important. Well, it turns out we then did something called a dimensionality reduction using principal components analysis, another type of algorithm that's important in this context. But basically, it represented the 121-dimensional feature vector as a set of basis vectors, and so components. And we realized that by looking at how much of the variance was explained by the first component, you really only needed the first one, which turned out to be 50 of these features. So 50 of the features represented almost all of the information, which was nice because it meant we had a smaller set. And we then took those and applied them to a random forest classifier and classified whether or not these were benign or malignant lung nodules. And we had radiologist truth. And lo and behold, I don't remember which of these, but you can see these ROC curves all look very good. The perfect curve goes up to 1 and across, right? So these are all very high. AUC value is the area under the ROC curve, which is how we determine how good they are. An AUC of 1 is perfect. High AUCs of 0.7 are normal. AUC of 0.5 is random. So anything above 0.5 is good. We were always above 0.9. So just this, which is the way I've always done it, as I showed you in the previous example, we got as good as a radiologist. So my colleagues are really big on convolutional neural networks. So they trained a CNN, a simpler one than the one I showed you, to solve the same problem. It came up with a 200-dimensional feature space representation. It found 200 features that it thought were important. And it did slightly better than what this method did, but they were equivalent, and they were both equivalent to a radiologist. So then I think it was Jason who had the idea, well, what if we combine them? I said, well, it won't do any good, right? They both found the same answers. They're both equivalent. So why would we combine them? Okay, he's a student. We did it anyway. Really brilliant idea, because we learned, that's the whole reason for this paper, when we combine the two results and put them together through this random forest classifier, so now it's a 250-dimensional feature vector, we got a better answer than either of them by themselves. Each of the approaches was good, but they each found different information than the other. And when we looked at the feature vector, oh, of course they did, because the CNN learned features that don't make any sense to a radiologist, but they seem to work. And there's different information in that than in these human-engineered features. And so the combination actually gave us a better answer. And so we've gotten real big into this. Let's chain these machine learning algorithms together to improve the result. And we hope that the people at Nature think that that was a good idea. So I am winding down. I told you were going to be wondering if this was ever going to end. I wanted to show you some of the examples, some areas where we use machine learning, because I've just skimmed the surface. But I focused really on classification, and I indicated how you might make predictions using a discriminant function to predict what class something falls into. Clustering, I mentioned briefly, but there's a huge literature in different clustering algorithms, hierarchical clustering, k-means clustering, goes on and on and on. Knowledge extraction is something that I'm very interested in, and there's another whole lecture we can talk about that. But it's the idea of using machine learning to extract new knowledge out of data. Data compression, I could have shown you this remember the 3-layer neural network? Well, it turns out the representation in the hidden layer tells you everything you need to know, and so you can actually compress the input down to the size of the hidden layer. It's a way of doing data compression. It's not very commonly used, but there are lots of different ways of using machine learning to compress data by learning a smaller representation of it. So, for example, the discriminant function is a simple mathematical rule that allows you to do a fairly complex process. I don't need the machine learning anymore if I got the discriminant function. So it's various ways in which you can compress data. Similarly, finding outliers. I've got this nice classifier, and then, oops, there's that point over there. Well, okay, what's wrong with that point? Because it's so far out that it probably shouldn't be there. Let's go understand it. And if it is there, then either way, we learn something. Learning associations, pattern recognition. I've talked about that in a number of cases here, because that's really what we're interested in, is finding patterns in data, and that's one of the big uses of machine learning. Particularly, I gave you the example of non-supervised learning. And these are some of the areas that we explore. Image recognition, computer vision, that's the kind of examples I've been showing you. Speech recognition, we do the whole thing with how does Alexa understand what I'm telling it? Well, it doesn't always, but sometimes it does. Alexa or Siri or you name it, whatever your favorite voice recognition system is. They're based on machine learning. Medical diagnosis. One of the earliest systems back in the Stone Age, a system called Mycin, actually made medical diagnoses from looking at the primitive medical records that it could be given. I just showed you examples where we were trying to do risk analysis or diagnosis on cancer based on data. Risk stratification, just a variation on that. Malware detection and computer security. This is a huge booming industry that's not necessarily in our domain, but it's a major use of machine learning, learning the patterns, the attack patterns of various malware entities. You know, people who are trying to get into your computer, learning from examples how they do that. And of course, natural language processing. How do we take data, free text reports that we've put into electronic health record system, how do we turn that into machine understandable information? Again, an example of machine learning. Here's some common software packages. I'm a MATLAB guy, so I tend to use MATLAB, although I'm learning R. And so, as it turns out, the machine learning examples that I showed you, that's not true. The first random forest was done in MATLAB. The second one with the convolutional network was done in R. And there are tons of R packages for machine learning. If you go to this website, you'll get the top N. TensorFlow is another open source package that a lot of people use. Scikit-learn, I didn't know about before, but it seems to be another growing example of open source. These are, except for MATLAB, these are open source machine learning tools. And the MATLAB tools are really solid, very good, and most of the R packages, particularly these top-rated ones, are excellent.
Stata's released some machine learning stuff too.
I'm sorry?
Stata.
Yes.
Just released some machine learning stuff.
Yeah, actually, almost everybody is getting into machine learning. The new software development kit for the iPhone has machine learning algorithms in it. And so it's popping up everywhere. I know I'm late, but I'm going to just touch briefly on artificial intelligence because it's another hot topic.
You're okay, Fred. You're fine. You're good.
Okay. Artificial intelligence is really what Turing was talking about. And in fact, it's sort of what people computer science has been searching for. It's how do I make a machine that can do the things that humans can do? And I've already told you the answer is, guess what, you can't. At least not with a Turing machine. Perhaps with a quantum computer you can, but that remains to be seen. This works both ways, and it's actually one way has worked better than the other. So you can look at brains and nervous systems and find really interesting ways of doing computation. And that turns out to work really well for designing new computer algorithms, new machine learning, et cetera, new AIs. Computer models, going back to understanding brains, doesn't work too well at all. that one hasn't turned out to be as useful. But that bidirectional path is still there. So what is AI? Machine learning is a part of it. AI is really about machine reasoning. Ultimately, does a machine know that it's reasoning? Self-knowledge? Can I build a machine that knows what it knows? There's a very classic philosophy problem made by John Searle. It's called the Chinese room problem, and it's a classic problem in AI. There's a room, and I slide characters, Chinese characters, in a slot on one side, and I get back out on the other side English characters. Okay? I don't know whether there's a person in the room who does the translation or whether there's a machine that does the translation. But Searle's argument is, if it's a machine, all it's doing is shuffling symbols. The human knows what the symbols mean. The machine doesn't know what they mean. It just knows this symbol goes to that symbol. And so the Chinese room problem is a standard test, another one of these standard tests for AI. There is no artificial intelligence that actually knows what it's doing. Right? Although you can see with the kind of deep learning that I was just presenting, where the algorithms themselves are learning how to learn, we're moving in, I think Alan Turing would agree we're moving in the right direction. So AI was just, its intent is to build artificial consciousness, artificial intelligence. The early work focused on writing rules. I did part of my doctoral dissertation building a knowledge base of thousands of rules to determine if a radiologist gets an image like this one, what other images would they want to have in order to properly diagnose this one? And after building 3,000 rules, 3,000 plus, and having a big battle with a colleague at the University of Arizona because it was my expert system better than her expert system, another more senior gentleman from the University of Washington said, 3 rules, works 80% of the time, give up. So, but anyway, it was fun. So this kind of rule-based system was very popular. They were called expert systems. And you built a set of rules, and you had an inference engine, which was the logic, we would call a data flow diagram now, the logic of how the rules were applied. And if, when a rule fired, that changed the state of the system, and so that may cause other rules to fire. That's the way it tried to emulate human decision processing. And so Mycin was actually it was actually an expert system. So huge amount of work going into this field. Yes, there was 10 years where it stopped, but since then it's been booming. And since the introduction of deep learning, which really came back into vogue, at least in our world, about 5 years ago, every grant that I read is full of deep learning. And that's the way you approach almost every problem. But we're still a long way. If you saw the movie 2001, a HAL 9000, a self-aware computer, or Skynet from Terminator, sorry, not even close. Even though a lot of people think Watson is that machine. I actually was doing a seminar at AMIA year before last we were talking about machine learning and in imaging, kind of work that I just was showing you. And I had a room full of, half the room was full of MDs. And they were terrified they were going to lose their job because they'd seen the demo of Watson. In fact, Watson is now trying to take the board exams to be a board certified radiologist. Okay? So it's going to take away my job. The only person in the room who wasn't frightened was the radiologist. He said, no, it's just another tool. It's going to give me information that I will use with my judgment to determine what the right answer is. And he was absolutely right. Because as I mentioned in the beginning of this, it's been mathematically proven that humans do things that are non-computable. So that is a Turing machine, and it cannot do things that we do. It can do a lot of amazing things, but it cannot do the things that we do. So it can't actually think. It couldn't pass the Chinese room problem, but it can play Jeopardy really, really well. And that's what it was designed to do. And interestingly enough, game playing turns out to be one of the real tests for AI systems. One of Turing's predictions was the last game to be conquered would be Go, and that was true. I think an algorithm beat a Go master. It was either last year or 2015, I don't remember, but it was fairly recently. So Go is a tough game. Jeopardy turned out to be easier. But the thing that Watson has going for it, if you look at this diagram, is encyclic knowledge. So they have these two knowledge bases, and they're huge. It's essentially the content of the internet distilled down into throw away the junk and keep the good stuff. So answers and evidence, and they go back and forth between them in this loop of generating hypotheses, testing hypotheses, and trying to converge on what should be the best answer for the question that's been posed. Because remember, what should be the best question for the answer that was proposed, because it was designed to play Jeopardy. A colleague of mine, Tanvir Syed Mahmood, works for IBM at the Almaden Research Center in San Jose. She is their expert on imaging. And She's been working for a long time. I've forgotten the name of her product. I don't think I wrote it down. But she's been working for a long time to take all the machine learning algorithms that apply to imaging and all the feature extraction approaches that we've all been working on and condense them down to a set of standard algorithms, build a layer on top of Watson, which then generates these answer and evidence sources, in the context of interpreting radiology images. So quantitative image analysis, the kind of stuff that we do, it all gets funneled into IBM's Almaden Lab and built into a layer on top of Watson. And that's why Watson is trying to pass the radiology boards as a radiologist, because it actually can do just about every form of quantitative analysis and then use that through this inference process to make diagnoses. Now, I wouldn't want Watson determining whether or not I have cancer, but as a tool to help radiologists or other physicians, it's a good idea. To me, the biggest thing that Watson is going to do is solve a problem that we all have. But it was recently calculated that by 2020, the volume of medical knowledge in the world will double every 52 days. So you can't possibly keep up. You know, it's the old story of if I read a paper every hour, by the end of the year, I'm 400 years behind. So you can't keep up. But if you had an encyclopedic system that's sorting through all the published literature, distilling it down to the evidence says this is something you should pay attention to. That's an extremely valuable tool, not just for physicians, but for all of us, right? You want to know where the state of the art is in your field. If you had this thing set up correctly, it would tell you. And I think that's the killer app that IBM is going to eventually come to, not trying to become a physician, but becoming the world's best physician's assistant. So anyway, this is what many people think of as the state of the art of AI systems, although there are a lot of other really interesting ones that have more power than Watson, but Watson gets all the hype, and it's largely because they took this approach of encyclopedic knowledge to drive their inference engine, where most other algorithms are limited to solving a problem. This thing will take on any problem as long as it looks like Jeopardy. So I hope you got the idea that machine learning can be a very powerful tool, has a tremendous number of applications in biomedical informatics, but in just, you name the field. I didn't bore you with all the other applications. I've just barely scratched the surface. I mean, in any one of those application areas, there are hundreds of algorithms and variations on algorithms, ways of combining algorithms to do amazing new things. So this is a tremendously active research area. I don't keep up with the computer science end of who's developing new algorithms. I'm more focused on the application area. So I'm trying to solve a problem. Let's say extract features from time series of matrices. Well, it turns out there's a whole group of algorithms that just were published in the last few months to deal with that problem. So just keeping up with that is a big enough problem. So I think that's my way of saying the last point in this slide, which is in biomedical informatics, you might decide that you want to develop the world's perfect new machine learning algorithm, but for most of us, it's picking the right tool for the job. I'm interested in solving a biomedical research or medical question. I want to pick the right tool that will allow me to get the best answer for that. And so I want to understand machine learning at the level of I can choose the tools, and I understand what they're telling me, and I understand when they're failing, which is the hard one. So hope I didn't bore you too much or babble on for longer than you could tolerate. I did ask you a few questions, so feel free to ask me some.
Can we check to see if there were any questions?
I did not hear even one thing during his talk.
I
I was listening for things.
only see one.
Click on the purple thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, click there. And then the chat button is the one all the way over to the left. There you go.
I don't see any chatters.
I know, you usually can get dings, but usually it's because of technical trouble. And we've had some folks, troubleshooting some of the issues in here. So it was good news that dings were quiet today.
Okay.
No questions, guys?
Well, there are a lot of interesting problems, and in any of the areas that you're working in, there are applications for machine learning.
Yeah, so I've been listening to this, and I know that in our department, the Health Systems and Services District, we just had someone apply machine learning techniques for their dissertation. They're applying it to predicting opioid use. And you heard, it's been very interesting to watch them develop that. But like, so, and you heard me earlier talking about home health. Because a big part of why I'm pursuing this is because Medicare's trying to find ways to identify fraud and waste.
Sure.
My guess is that you can realistically apply machine learning to almost anything. But I guess, like, how do you then start saying, because I'm thinking like, well, maybe I want to do this to outliers and use machine learning on the data that I want to put on health to predict these outliers who are clearly fraudulent, or do I want to look at the efficiencies? How do you distill down
That's the trick.
what you're going to work with?
That's the trick that you have. That's the science that you're adding to it. How do I apply these tools to answer an important question? And so one of the things is you can look for the outliers. Do a discrimination task and identify outliers in a very rigorous way, and then you can begin to explore those. Then you might say, okay, now I've got a whole collection of outliers. Are there common patterns in those outliers? Common themes that of course, we wouldn't necessarily have the data, right? You know it's an outlier, you know what caused it to be an outlier, but you don't know all the other information about those subjects, but you could find it. You could find additional information. Say, okay, what's common among them? Are there algorithms or approaches that they're taking to commit fraud, which is what the computer security people do all the time. They're looking for those patterns and an attack. How does malware or some entity, what are their patterns of attack? So it turns out you've heard a lot about Russians making cyber attacks and North Koreans and Chinese. Well, they all have, at least according to the folks at the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, they all have signatures, attack patterns that they use repeatedly. And they learn those attack patterns, which is how they say, oh, that was the Chinese again. Now, of course, you can fake that, because anybody can learn the same attack patterns, and I can pretend I'm Chinese. Right? But so those are just some ideas that came to the top of my head. You can apply machine learning algorithms to look at the problem in different ways, and iteratively, so that I find outliers, now I find information about the outliers, and then maybe there's another step after that when you see some of the patterns. Well, how does this pattern, I'm making it up.
So where would you start then? If you were new, to start, where would you point someone in the direction? It can be overwhelming.
Yeah. So, well, I'll tell you what I did. It's why you heard a lot about classification problems. I could understand classification problems. I started there, and I started with very simple linear classifiers. And then a colleague from Yahoo convinced me, no, I had to use random forests. So then I had to learn about random forests. And then I learned a bit about support vector machines. But I was working on classifying different things in different ways, right? So in my case, it's different aspects of cancer. How do I turn this question into a classification problem? So that was my approach. And then I started with simple algorithms and went to more complicated ones when the simple ones hit limits that, I couldn't. So a support vector machine allows you to make these complicated hyperplanes that I couldn't do with a linear classifier, for example. So that's one way of looking at it. There are many others. Yeah.
So for the unsupervised approaches, do they define convergence differently?
Yes.
And can you kind of talk about some main approaches to that? Because it's kind of like, God, 25 years since I've been anything related to this, and I'm sure it's changed a lot.
The first one is back to Turing. Did it complete? Does this complete in finite amount of time, or does it just keep running? So if it didn't converge, it will run forever. Right? Convergence means it finds a solution. So that's the first one. There are a variety of different convergence criteria you can set and models for forcing things to converge, depending upon what kind of unsupervised learning you're using. That is another whole lecture about how to do that. I mentioned these neural networks that Grossberg made. We actually played around with those for a little bit. And what you do is, when it's not converging, you adjust the ratio of positive to negative reinforcement, or stimulation versus depression. And usually you add a little bit more depression and it converges better. It dampens out all the oscillations. But so that's and there are rigorous ways of determining how to do that based upon what the behavior of the given system is. But I don't have a ready-made lecture in that, because it's a big topic of how to get even the supervised ones to converge and in finite time.
Are they all convergence-based, or are there other methods of doing that, of determining when it's done?
Well, the way you determine when it's done is you iterate until it meets your acceptance criteria. You minimize some error, or it's not. You can look at these as variations on an optimization problem. So you're optimizing a particular characteristic. So convergence is one criteria, that it converges to an answer in a finite period of time. Sometimes you just say, well, it's not going to converge. We'll stop here. That's the answer. But then you have to validate that to say, well, how close is that? If it's a supervised training, how close is it to the known right answer? If it's unsupervised, it's like, that's the answer, and I don't know how good it is. Right? That's part of the problem. So convergence and convergence to an acceptable error are still major research questions. And I was, while talking, trying to think of an algorithm where that isn't an issue. I'm sure there are some, but none that I've ever used. And there's lots, if you're interested, I can recommend lots of good books. Some of them are in here. As Meredith saw, I had a stack about yay high on my desk. That's just from my library. And that's just the recent ones. So very hot topic, a lot of really good work. And as I said, there's good software that you can use that's understandable to get started. And some examples, there's a really nice R textbook on data analytics. And it has really good sections. I didn't put the reference in here, but I can give it to you. That is as examples of how to use some of these in sort of real-world problems that are relevant. Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of things on the net, examples. And some of those are referenced in here. That's why I put a lot of references for where figures and things came from, because they came from articles that are useful that explain more details about some things. I mean, any of these given things like training, backpropagation, I could have done the math, but I probably wouldn't have been a good use of time. But if you're interested, I can show you what it is and go through it. That's one that's easy. The backpropagation for a convolutional neural net, I believe it. I'm not sure I could derive it. So am I ready to turn off the recording?